Welcome, viewers. It's early April in 2020, and we are in the grip of a coronavirus pandemic. The world is feeling the effects, be it the direct effects of the disease or societal effects. Unfortunately, there are a lot of knock-on effects. Like conferences, the Undoing Aging one has been postponed, and I'm in lockdown here in Australia, and many other people are elsewhere in the world as well. So this pandemic underscores the absolute necessity to solve, in my belief, fundamental problems in health. So one of the questions we'll be asking is, how might regenerative medicine help with pandemics in the future? So I'm delighted to host biomedical gerontologist Aubrey de Grey, who is the CEO of SENS Research Foundation and VP of New Tech Discovery at Ajax Therapeutics, and the author of the book Ending Aging. He's also got a really long list of accomplishments, too much to mention here, but I'm sure the audience know this already, at least most of the audience. So welcome, Aubrey de Grey.
Well, thanks very much, Adam, for having me on the show again.
Yes. Well, first of all, I just wanted to ask you the general question of how are things going at SENS and Ajax Therapeutics and regenerative medicine in general at this time?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we are in lockdown too in California, and so things are going very slowly, if at all. We do have just the ability to have one or two people in the building at our laboratory in Mountain View at any one time. I haven't been in the building for more than a couple of weeks now. So yeah, it's not good. And of course, there's masses of other activities that we have that are also being impacted. For me, the one big thing is that I'm not doing any traveling around the world giving talks, which of course is what I spend a lot of my time doing normally. And so not only is that affecting my income, it's also affecting my ability to get the word out and really help people to understand the importance of the work that we do. Of course, I'm making up for that by activities like what I'm doing right now. In other words, I'm doing just as many interviews as ever. But yeah, the world is very different right now, and we hope it won't be this way for too long.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think what could have happened if we were had the ball rolling with at least our understanding of pandemics in general a little bit earlier. So COVID-19 does seem to affect older people and also people with existing diseases, especially. So, how might regenerative medicine help in general?
Well, yes. So, I mean, regenerative medicine, of course, is a term that has historically been used rather narrowly, simply to cover essentially stem cell therapy and tissue engineering. I have always felt that it would be better if the term were used more generally to cover all aspects of restoration of structure and composition of the body, which is essentially what we work on at SANS. But that hasn't really caught on, so I've more or less given up on that and accepted that the best way to talk about what we do is rejuvenation biotechnology. In other words, to make up my own term, to cover all of the damage repair approaches that we take. So within rejuvenation biotechnology, certainly the restoration of the immune system is a big, big deal because the immune system obviously does work considerably less well in the elderly, and that is the consequence of changes in what it's built from, changes in the number of various types of white blood cell, changes in the size of an organ named the thymus, which is very important for generating some of those white blood cells, things like that. And we are very focused and have been for many, many years on fixing that problem in its various guises. So definitely we are hoping that one silver lining of this current crisis will be an enhanced understanding of the value that could occur from success in the research that we're doing in rejuvenating the immune system. And of course, not just the research that we're doing, but also research that people in our ambit, in our network, are doing. The fact that, as you mentioned, the coronavirus is particularly age specific. In other words, the elderly always tend to be more affected by infections, but in this case, they are massively more affected. Perhaps that will further accentuate and concentrate people's minds on the value of such research.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's incredible that you're doing this stuff. And what Can I ask, like, can you drill down on some of the aspects of either the seven deadly things that which ones do you think? I mean, maybe we could say all of them, but which one specifically would be able to help with dealing with pandemics in general, especially coronavirus?
Sure. Well, in the very, very early days of science, 20 years ago, I actually included rejuvenation of the immune system as one of the strands that I talked about. So there were 9 strands originally. There was immune rejuvenation and endocrine rejuvenation as separate categories. But I began to realize pretty quickly that actually those categories were more accurately and more informatively described as falling into, as being subsumed within the other categories. So in particular, the reason why the immune system doesn't work so well in the elderly is partly because of cell loss, which comes down to atrophy of this organ called the thymus, and also loss of certain types of cell, especially cells that come from the thymus, namely naive T cells. Then also the accumulation of cells that we don't want that are in a dysfunctional state. So this is rather similar to the accumulation of senescent cells, but it's not quite the same because the cells in question here have a different gene expression profile than classical senescent cells, but still the manner of getting rid of them is kind of the same. So they come under my heading of death-resistant cells. And then thirdly, there are changes to the internal composition of such cells. For example, we now know that there are problems that accumulate in the lymph nodes, which appear to also impede the ability of certain white blood cells to do their job. These problems may actually include extracellular problems, in other words, changes to the extracellular matrix that make the lymph node less able to do its job. And that's actually at a relatively early stage of research. We are still trying to understand really what is the problem there and how to go about it. But yeah, that's another example of another category that's involved here. So yeah, the aging of the immune system definitely falls under the 7 categories, and bits of that problem fall under different categories.
Now, luckily, I've got the opportunity to interview Nobel laureate Peter Doherty very soon. In fact, he was one of the founders of T cells. So it's interesting you brought up naive T cells. Would you want to describe that in detail, how that affects the immune system?
Sure. Okay. So yeah, T cells are part of what's called the adaptive immune system. So that means the part of the immune system that relies for its function on genetic diversity. So there are these very specific parts of our genome which are not the same in every cell, and the difference between them happens on purpose. There is something called a hypermutational process, which rearranges and mutates these particular small regions of the genome in T cells, and also in the other type of cell that's part of the adaptive immune system, namely B cells. So these cells need to have this diversity, because what happens when an infection is suffered is that the T cells do not all dive on the infection and get rid of it, but rather they go through a selection process where there's some teeny tiny minority of the T cell population that is found to be cognate, as it's called, for the infection. In other words, they can create they can create counterparts of the infection and thereby eliminate it. And the way they do that is by that tiny subset of the population proliferating like crazy and getting to be a very large subset of the population and then going and getting rid of the infection. After that happens, this crazily amplified population mostly dies off, and just a few of them remain as what are called memory cells, which are able then to respond much more rapidly than the first time if the infection comes back a second time. So that's handy. But the whole thing relies on what's called the polyclonality, the diversity of the initial T cells, which are called naive T cells. And that is something that declines, especially in late life, as a result of essentially exhaustion of the system. So we end up being less able to fight off infections as a result of this. Now, this would not happen if new T cells, new naive T cells, were continuing to be generated throughout life. But it turns out that that doesn't happen because the organ that is responsible for doing that early in life atrophies. This is the thing called the thymus. So one thing that we definitely feel we need is a rejuvenated thymus. And people are looking at building whole new thymuses with tissue engineering. They're looking at ways to use growth factors to regrow the existing thymus. Various approaches are being tried, and there are quite promising initial results. That's not the whole of immune rejuvenation by any means, but it's a very big part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I remember there being a couple of talks at the Undoing Aging conference last year on the thymus. So is there any particular research projects at the moment that are focusing on this that you'd like to bring up?
Well, actually, the one that's most exciting to me right now, largely because it's very new and people don't know very much, most people don't know about it really, is one that was showcased at Undoing Aging last year by a great friend of mine, a guy who's been on our scientific advisory board for a long time. His name is Janko Nikolich-Žugich, and he is a professor in Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona. We funded his lab quite a long time ago to experiment with a way that we thought would be effective in rejuvenating the immune system in mice. And it basically didn't work. And that was a bit of a disappointment, but of course, not every project works in science. That's what science is about. So we kind of just forgot about it. And then last year, the year before, Janko came along and said, "I figured out why it didn't work." Essentially, he worked out that the cells that the thymus needs to create, these things called naive T cells, are being created at elevated levels, restored not completely, but partly to the levels that young mice would make them at. But those T cells were then not able to do their job because of malfunction of these other important organs in the immune system called the lymph nodes. And as I say, this is a very early stage, this work so far, but of course the hope is that we will figure out how to rejuvenate the lymph nodes as well, and then the T cell population will genuinely act as well as it would in a young individual.
Right, definitely. Well, I'm certainly hoping to have that happen in the near term. Well, I mean, that would directly, seemingly affect people's response to the coronavirus. I mean, if they had a much better functioning immune system, especially functioning T cells and not naive T cells or sort of mutated T cells that actually attack the wrong cells, I think that's how it works, then that would be fantastic. Look, is there any other projects which you're excited? Sorry, you were about to say something?
Well, yes, so there's a lot more to it than that. So one
Yes,
thing
sure.
we have to bear in mind is that vaccines don't work so well in the elderly either. And that's not really a T cell problem, or at least it's not mainly a T cell problem. It's a problem relating to other aspects of the immune system, including the innate immune system, which also don't work so well. You alluded a moment ago to autoimmunity, which of course is also elevated in the elderly, and that's largely for the same reason that the immune system just gets less precise at being able to distinguish self from non-self. So yeah, all of these things need to be done. It's a complicated, very much a multifaceted problem, a bit like aging in microcosm, really.
Yeah, true. Is there any other projects which you're particularly interested or see hope in dealing with pandemics in the future?
Well, I mean, we always have to remember that the immune system is just one part of the body that goes downhill, and all parts of the body talk to each other all the time. So at the end of the day, we know that full rejuvenation of the immune system can only occur once we rejuvenate the whole body. Not just the things that are really, normally considered to be parts of the immune system. But yeah, if we can fix the immune system properly in the first place, then that is definitely going to be the most important part.
If you were to prioritize, if you had the power to prioritize and schedule research, surely you'd say everything would be done now. But like, given limited resources, what do you think needs to be done first?
Well, actually, let me answer that question in a slightly different way.
Sure.
I think that actually we need to address the premise of the limitation of resources. One thing that I am definitely hoping we will be able to extract as a silver lining of this crisis is a greater degree of rationality about health in general and about healthcare on the part of the key decision makers around the world. Because let's face it, we have been caught short here. It's very clear that there were opportunities to be more prepared for a pandemic and to be able to put not just social measures like social distancing, but also actual medical measures like antibodies and so on in place much more quickly than is happening in practice. So, of course, the question is whether those lessons will actually be learned. And one always has the well-known dictum that generals prepare for the previous war, so there's always something different next time. But at the same time, I think we can be reasonably hopeful that lessons will be learned about the value of prevention and preparedness for new problems, and maybe that will translate into a better rationality and sense of proportion with regard to healthcare in general. People will actually perhaps start to pay attention to the fact that the elderly are extraordinarily expensive because they're sick. And if we could make them less sick or not so sick until later, until they reach an older age, then the economy would benefit a great deal. And that is an argument that's been made over and over again by people in the field of gerontology, including myself, of course, for many, many years. But maybe it will fall on somewhat less deaf ears when people's minds have been concentrated on the importance of actually pursuing medical research that looks promising, and indeed evaluating what is promising more objectively than has been happening in the past.
Absolutely, yeah. That's I hope so too. And well, I mean, is there any signs of this happening? Is there any like conversations you've heard politicians or lawmakers or policy makers have been having, which sounds hopeful?
Well, in terms of the fallout from the crisis, I think it's far too early to say. At the moment, everyone's just focused on getting through the crisis, and all this business about preparedness for the next crisis will be conversations that can happen after that, I think. However, more generally, yes, I can say that I'm pretty happy about one thing that's been happening and which was beginning to get some real momentum before the virus came along,
Absolutely.
namely that we have been reaching out quite energetically over the past few months to the political elite within the US, especially in Washington, D.C. We have been aided in this very strongly by the fact that our current CEO, our interim CEO, in fact, is a guy named Jim O'Neill, who has been on our board of directors since almost the beginning of the foundation, but who has only played a very peripheral role day to day. However, now he has come in to be the temporary replacement for Mike Cope, who left last year to lead our most recent spin-out company, Underdog Pharmaceuticals.
Oh, nice.
And the reason why Jim is so relevant to all of this is not just because he's been in our community for a long time, but because before he was in our community, 10 or 12 years ago, he was actually in government. He was number 3 at the Department of Health and Human Services
Mm,
in the Bush administration. And he maintains a very broad and deep network of connections within the Beltway, within Washington, D.C., which he is leveraging quite energetically right now. And so we are well set to have have a strong voice within the U.S. administration. And if that can be, leveraged and translated into actual better decision making in terms of allocation of money, then we could be talking about something very important.
Fantastic. I'm really happy to hear. I didn't know that. Well done. So yeah, I might reach out to Jim O'Neill maybe for an interview if he'd been interested in that as well.
Yeah, I think we
Um,
can raise that.
yeah, that'd be fantastic. So, well, I mean, what about, Senolytics? I mean, that was discussed heavily last year at the Undoing Aging conference. Is there anything specific about that that would relate to the coronavirus that we
Yeah,
could
what
discuss?
kind of? I mean, so as I mentioned, one of the problems that we see in immune senescence is the accumulation of cells that are not really doing their job anymore, at least not all of their job. There are cells called anergic T cells, which occupy a large proportion of the immune space, the white blood cell population in the elderly. And they are able to do some, but not all of the things that T cells normally do. So, we'd kind of like to get rid of them and replace them with cells that are more completely functional. And that is very much the same kind of problem as removing senescent cells. You would typically expect that they would need different types of drug, but the way in which we would discover such drugs, or indeed other systems for getting rid of these cells, like suicide gene therapy, for example, those methods would be very similar to what's being used on senescent cells. And right now, I mean, there's a lot of interest in this simply because the work on Senolytics has, as you say, been moving forward very strongly. In fact, this year, our keynote speaker, well, at least was going to be, and I hope still will be, Ned David, who is, of course, the president of Unity Biotechnology, the leading company in that space. Unity have been doing fantastic work over the past year or two, especially in the early stages of clinical trials. First of all, on osteoarthritis. They're also going to move on to macular degeneration, I think, or perhaps, I forget, some part of blindness anyway. So, yeah, there's a lot of great progress there. We're seeing really, really promising results.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything specific to infectivity that could be focused on? I mean, is there like the way that the virus travels and the way that it's transmitted, other than social distancing, is there anything, and sort of, I guess, social band-aids to the problem, is there anything that could be done more fundamentally to
Well, I
reduce
mean,
that?
of course, every virus is different in that regard. Every infection is different. Different infections get into the body in different ways, and take a hold in different ways. But certainly, yes, there are aspects of the immune system that are, aspects of aging that impair the ability of people to not be infected in the first place. For example, the gut becomes leaky, and that's definitely bad for you, and things can get in that way. I think that mainly will affect bacterial infections more than viral infections, but still, that matters too.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Okay, so you've spoken about some of the things that we can learn from the current pandemic. Is there any slowdowns or speed ups would you like to see in the current research paradigm that you can see currently that has been worked on, which needs a big boost in either money or just talent?
Well, it's all really about money because the talent is easy to find when you have the money. I've always found that getting the best scientists interested in working on the most important problems is actually really easy. Getting them to actually do the work only requires to be able to pay them so that they can keep the personnel. But yeah, I mean, the only way that I would really prioritize things right now is it's still all about prioritizing the things that other people are not doing. And over the last 5 years, as the industry has emerged, the actual private sector component of this crusade, the more straightforward, well, not straightforward, but the relatively easier components of the damage repair portfolio have, of course, been able to benefit from investment and thereby to get to a point where really the financial support that they need is no longer the rate limiter. And it's actually, they are moving more or less as fast as the science allows.
Nice.
Which is fantastic. And of course, as I mentioned, it applies to a number of the projects that we have incubated over the years that we were successful in spinning out. We've spun out half a dozen projects now as startup companies. So that's all very wonderful. However, question of the other projects, the ones that are still being pursued within the foundation, is still absolutely essential because, as you know, being a divide and conquer approach, the damage repair paradigm does require everything to be working. Pretty much any type of damage that accumulates with age in the body can kill you on its own, more or less on schedule, however well we fix all the others. So we cannot neglect any of them. And for sure, it remains the case that the foundation is very woefully underfunded. We could totally go at least twice as fast in our research if we had just one more digit on our budget. And our budget is still a paltry $5 million per year. And the projects that we're doing, are correspondingly going more slowly than they could, but they're still going. And of course, every little bit of progress that we make makes the whole thing look more plausible and gets more and more people to think, they might actually, it might actually be a good place to put their money.
Well, I'm hoping after this pandemic, or even during the time of this pandemic, we can reassess and reprioritize what sorts of projects we fund. But what sorts of things can we do? What conversations, what actions can we have right now that will increase the likelihood of that happening?
Of course, every conversation we have that that gets the word out in any way, whether we're talking about the science or the social context or the financial issues or whatever, all of these conversations will have some effect on some people because, everyone still has different kinds of misconception and, errors in their understanding of whether this thing is feasible, whether it's desirable, how much difference a dollar can make, things like that. And so just getting the word out, just improving people's understanding of where these things are, can make a difference. Every dollar makes a difference, and every person who's listening to this broadcast or every other broadcast that I or any of my colleagues do is in a position to save a life.
Thank you very much, Aubrey, and look forward to seeing you and chatting again in the future.
Absolutely.
Stay safe.
Indeed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.